All right. It is time for us to get started. Sorry, Charlie. I saw John Dean has a mic. Who else has a mic tonight? Jonathan Bailey and John Dean. See if I can find out where those are. Okay, they're out already unmuted. Yep, we're good. John, will you lead us in prayer and we'll get started?
Father God, we're grateful for just another chance to come together and be with one another and to look to your word, to learn more about how your son lived, how we should live, a reflection of you. And God, we pray that you help us be open-minded at this hour, that you help us be a participant, that you give us the courage to ask questions if there's something that we don't know, and just work through all of us this evening to help all of us learn more about your great ways. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so we are in Exodus chapter 20. If you've got a lesson book, we're on page 28, and we're in lesson 10. And our verse for tonight is verse 15. You shall not steal. You shall not steal. So to get us started, I thought I'd ask this question, and make sure you raise your hands to answer for the folks at home. But if stealing is wrong, and probably we could qualify that usually with stealing is wrong when it's done out of greed or for self-gain, but there's some who would say stealing when in need is not as wrong or is not wrong as compared to when you're not in need. In other words, is it justifiable ever to steal? Is it justifiable ever to steal? Need some participation. Waiting for some answers. Throw your hands in the air. Joe's going to step into the waters.
Well, there is a passage that talks about someone stealing when they're destitute or poor and in hunger, and it talks about restitution after the fact. So, is it justified? I think the Lord knew that it would happen, and He offered up a way for the person who is caught in that scenario to think about it, in that they're going to work towards reversing what they've done, and it was more than 1x the time to. I mean, if you stole $100 or 100 grapes or whatever it was, I think it was 7x or something like that that you were to restore when you got to the ability to restore it. So, kind of like borrowing it with a lot of interest.
Okay. Anybody else? Eric here. Jonathan, Eric?
Well, from your question, I think that on the flip side of that, what would the church, or in this case Israel, what are they doing to ensure that that person is not in need?
Okay.
So, but when stealing becomes deceitful, they could, poor people could, glean what was left of the harvest and stuff like that. They like Joe said, there were things that they could do that would seem odd to us today. But I think the flip side of that question is, what's the church doing? What was Israel doing to make sure they're taking care of their own?
Okay. Good thoughts. Anybody else? Passage that Joe brings up is Proverbs chapter 6, verses 30 and 31. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his appetite when he's hungry. Now, at just reading that, notice what is mentioned. People do not despise. This is not about God. This is the way people view this. In verse 31, but if he is caught, he will pay sevenfold. He will give all the goods of his house. So the idea there in Proverbs 6 is people will, for lack of a better term, they'll kind of have compassion on somebody who's stealing because of need. But if they're caught stealing, even if it's because of need, there's still a penalty that has to be paid. The other passage to look at is in Proverbs chapter 30 in verse really 7 through 9. This is one of your questions as well. Starting in verse 7, the psalmist says, 2 things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who's the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. And here in Proverbs 30, the 2 requests, that he has is, 1, keep me from lying. That's his first request. And the second request is, don't let me be rich and don't let me be poor. And he explains why. Because if I'm rich, then I'm going to take credit for all this and forget God. But if I'm poor, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to steal, and therefore I'll profane God in the process of that. I think like Joe said, I think God is aware this is going to happen. That those who are in need will be tempted to steal and will give in to temptation. Now, to Eric's point, within the old law, there is allowances made that you are to leave the corners of your field, essentially, purposely leave some of your field unharvested. And specifically mentioned in that is wheat, grain, olives, those kind of things. And so that was automatically left on purpose in order to allow, kind of, for lack of a better term, a built-in welfare system. It's not quite like what we have, but you have the ability to go. Now, part of that also is, by the way, there's times of harvest and times of not, and those in poverty would still find themselves in want, and even then there were ways and allowances they were to be taken care of. By the way, very interesting, just quickly, that in the section in Jesus teaches about the Good Samaritan, when the lawyer comes and asks, and he says there, what is the law? And the lawyer says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. The lawyer then turns around and says, what? Who is my neighbor? And why did he ask that? To justify not having to help certain people out. So Jesus tells this story. We don't have time to go into this, and we may do it another time later. But that story, I think it's in Luke 10. If you go back and read Leviticus 19, which is where the quote is about loving your neighbor as yourself, the entire context there, before that, the Samaritan, Jesus almost takes apart that context and adds things in there. One of those is the commands about providing. And what is interesting is to see Jesus is painting a picture here where this Levite and this priest won't even help this Samaritan. They go to the other side of the street, the person beat up, the victim. The Samaritan stops and helps. But the Samaritan doesn't give. In that it talks about leaving the gleanings of the field, which would be grapes, olives, grain, the things that are grown. But if you notice in the story, if you go back and read, Jesus points out that the Samaritan uses his oil and his wine to take care of the victim. That was going a step beyond of what was required by the law. Rather than using and allowing them to have the raw materials, let's say, from your field, he shared of what he had already processed into the finished product. Another one of those, by the way, is in the same context, talks about making sure you pay a person a day's wage, which is how many denarii? What was a day's wage? 1. The Samaritan pays 2 and offers to pay more as needed. In all of these cases, if you go back and compare those, Jesus is really tearing down exactly what you're saying, this idea that the Israelites, especially the days of Jesus, had come to the idea of, well, what can I get away with not doing? And he uses a Samaritan. It's an intentional use of racial prejudice, but he also compares it back to Leviticus 19, the law of Moses, and shows this person they look down upon because of his race going above and beyond the law to do exactly what you're talking about, taking care of the poor and the needy. And it's a pretty fascinating study when you dive into that, and that gives you just a little morsel to think about. But it is interesting here that to get back to stealing, God knows the temptation will be there. He has done everything within his power to help them avoid that. But he also, it is not something that is justified. Just because the Proverbs say this will happen doesn't mean it's justified for it to happen. If it was, there would have been no penalty that was required 7 times, which was, by the way, pretty stiff. That's a pretty stiff penalty. And you should, as Joe says, if you think about that loan with interest, that's a pretty stiff interest. You should consider that. So you shall not steal. That's our command. What does that command prohibit? First off, what is stealing in its purest definition? Let me get Eric's got his hand up here. Oh, you just bought a cow if you do that. I'm just telling you, we're at an auction. You got a whole herd from that. What is stealing? What is the definition of stealing? Yeah, taking property that belongs to someone else without their permission. That's what stealing is. So, what does this law prohibit? I understand that the first answer, if I'm in a high school class, is taking someone else's stuff. Let's get that one out of the way. What else could be prohibited here? What else could be prohibited under this law? I get a mic to Linda. What's that? Crooked weights? Yeah, falsifying the scales, that's a problem, and Amos deals with that. Several of the other prophets deal with that. Weighting the scales. What else? What else? Yeah, not giving a... There's two versions of that, not paying someone a full day's wages for their work, but also not working a full day's work for your wages. Both of those would fit under here. What else? Not tithing, and we'll get to that in a little bit and talk about that. Yeah. A couple that we could see in Romans 13, I think, could be the idea of theft through deception in verse 7, and also theft from delaying payment in verses 8 and 9. Those are generally things that we could talk about here that seem to be covered and prohibited here. What are some practical ways we could be guilty of theft today? What are some ways you could be guilty of stealing today? Borrowing, not paying? What else? Yeah, not putting money in a parking meter? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, cheating on your taxes. There's a good one. Yeah, taking home office supplies. By the way, the cheating on the taxes is always interesting because let's just say this real quick. I know there's some of us that feel like taxes are stealing from us. Okay, I don't feel that way, but there's some people that do. Just want to remind you that God not only justified, but he blatantly approves of taxation. So in the New Testament, had there been a referendum against taxing, when they bring the coin to him and talk about who you should pay taxes to, he just said, don't pay taxes to anybody that's stealing. No. So I just want to cut that out now and not go down that path and all that kind of stuff. Okay? But cheating on your taxes would be. What else? That's it? That's all we got?
Borrowing your neighbor's Wi-Fi.
Borrowing your neighbor's Wi-Fi. Wait a minute, Jonathan. That doesn't cost them anything.
Or their Netflix password.
Yeah, That's why you just don't share passwords. We found out one time, by the way, our son had given somebody our Netflix password while they were in college, his roommate. We found that out because one time I tried to go log in, and his roommate's logged in Texas. And I'm like, I could fix that. And we just changed the password. And we didn't tell Peyton either for a while. And then, you know, Peyton, when he's, I think his freshman year, he really got used to using my Amazon account for orders. Changed that password too. And it was something like anybody but Peyton or something like that was the password for a while. But yeah, those things would qualify today. Shoplifting, which in the introduction I talk about, it's a pretty big deal. When I was in college, I worked at Target, and I worked in electronics, but I also assisted the asset protection team just because two things. I had a hallway that connected straight to the front door that I could go down in case we had somebody trying to steal something to help out. And obviously somebody shoplifting trying to get away, get the biggest guy on the team to help out with that. But it is amazing, by the way, the things people will do to steal. This is so long ago that we were still selling VCRs, so some of you in this room may not even know what those things are, but one of the tricks was, and this was, the FBI got involved with this, they would go in with a baby in a baby carrier. When they left, they'd be holding the baby, and the baby carrier would have two or three different VCRs stacked up with the blanket over top of it, because nobody bothers a baby. Then they could bring them back for gift cards or a discount or whatever, which is, by the way, that's why at Walmart and Target and all those places, you can't just return stuff like you used to, is because of people like that. Obviously, that would be prohibited as well. And I'll also tell you that when Duane started teaching, we were just dating at the time, one of the cutest kids I've ever met in my life. And he had been trained by his parents to shoplift. Because police, when a minor is involved in shoplifting, they just turn the minor back over to the parents. And so you have parents who get wise to that, and I'm talking about, this is first grade. Okay? First grader who was trained to steal, and not small items. Trained to steal because his parents knew they wouldn't arrest him. And I've seen similar cases like that as well in my experience. So it's a real problem, those kind of things, and obviously that would be removed from there. Part of this commandment, let's talk about the positive of this, is what we would call the law of property. And Acts chapter 5 illustrates that pretty well, the law of property. In Acts chapter 5, now in Acts chapter 5 is the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who are struck dead in Acts 5 for what? We've talked about this recently. What are they struck dead for? What's that? They lied. Specifically, they lied to the Spirit as part of this as well. So, I want to make sure we know what the penalty of death was for before we get into this. But in this, in other words, it was not because they sold a piece of property and they held back a portion of the proceeds for themselves. That was okay. In fact, that's kind of what Jesus says in verse 4. While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not at your disposal? This is what is often described as law of property. When you own something, it is yours. You sell it, the money that comes from selling it is yours. And so there's a respect for that law here in this commandment of you shall not steal. There's a recognition of property with this commandment. Things belong to other people. And that's important to kind of understand. When you take things that belong to other people, it's not yours, a violation of this command. Any questions or comments about that? That's just the simplest layer. Joe has a comment here. That's the simplest layer of this command.
Yeah, Exodus and Deuteronomy talk about, and then also Proverbs that you referenced earlier, talks about the penalty being restitution for whatever gets
Right.
that gets stolen. That's That's the penalty that God sets up in the Torah. But the first one, the very first example of stealing is man stealing in Exodus 21. And anyone caught in that or possessing a stolen person would be punished by death.
Yes.
And so
Human trafficking, in other words.
exactly. So they call it. The word is stealing.
Correct.
Man stealing.
Correct.
And but that's the only exception to
It's the only time this is a capital
a
punishment.
capital punishment, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and you could argue adultery, stealing a man's wife. Let's not call her property, but he talks about that.
Terry, 3 weeks ago, I guess we talked about don't take someone's life.
Right.
Last week was don't take someone's spouse.
Mm-hmm.
This week is don't take someone's stuff.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. All right. Let's talk about a few texts that aren't necessarily connected, but are somewhat. And the first of those is in Jeremiah chapter 7. These are two texts that talk about stealing from God. And their context is different, but I want you to see the connection somewhat between them. The first of those is in Jeremiah chapter 7, starting in verse 9. We'll start in verse 8. Behold, you trust in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods you've not known? By the way, he lists 6 commands the Israelites here have violated. And then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, only to go on doing all these abominations. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. Now, you might automatically see there's a connection in this text to Jesus, right? Because he talks about how the temple has become a den of robbers. And he talks about that in the context of those who were selling animals for sacrifice and making a profit in the court of the temple. What is the context here? How is the temple a den of robbers for them? What does this mean in this context? Because we don't see here the idea of money changers in the outer court of the temple. It's not the same thing. And by the way, I think this is one thing that's very interesting. Essentially, Jesus, to a degree, proof texts this passage, taking it out of its context and using it for his own good. Something that we often criticize ourselves for, Jesus is guilty of doing here, which means it may not always be a bad thing to do that, but just be careful about it. And what I mean by that is original context does not have the same connection to what Jesus is doing directly. It does indirectly. We're going to talk about that in a moment, and in Malachi. Well, yeah. You have to bring that up, but I'm just saying, it's just like topical sermons. You know, a lot of people don't like those. All the sermons in the Bible are topical for the most part. So what is he saying here? What is the den of robbers? How is the temple a den of robbers? How is the temple a den of robbers?
They're acting like
Wait. There we go. There we go.
they're acting like they're good and they're coming in to worship.
Okay? How does that make it a den of robbers?
They're lying about who they are.
Well, that'd be a den of liars, though.
Yeah, I know.
How's
Take it out of context again.
How's it a den of robbers?
We talked about stealing as being one of the definitions of withholding. They have promised something to God. They have promised faithfulness and loyalty to God, and they're withholding that from him and giving that to someone else. They're taking what they promised to one party, giving it to someone else, robbing God of what they owe him.
Okay.
It's context.
It fits. Maybe not the best fit, but it fits. Den of robbers back then, you can understand the context. Robbers would wait on these roads for passerbys to come through, and they would steal from them. And then they would go hide in caves after they had stolen. And that would be the den of robbers. That's the origin of the idea. What God through Jeremiah is saying is, you've turned the temple into your cave to hide out in. You go out and break these commands, and you go run to the temple and praise me and say, we're God's people, we're okay. And that's how the temple here has become a den of robbers. Does that make sense in the context? Because it's not just stealing here, it's breaking the majority of the commands is what they're doing. We're going to tie all this up in a minute, but I want you to see how that, in this context, which by the way is why I say Jesus is proof texting here. It's when you think about those two things, those are radically different in their context, okay? The language. Now, let's go to Malachi, and Malachi is a little bit different. Malachi in chapter 3, verses 8. And by the way, Malachi 3, 8, and 9 is the one we know well. This is the one that preachers like to quote in their giving sermon. Right? Will a man rob God, yet you are robbing me? And you say, how have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. What's the context here? How are they robbing God? This is where Jonathan was talking about. They are withholding from God what they owe God. And this is where Jonathan, this is why it was a good comment, is right in this sense. Here's what needs to be understood about this concept in the Old Testament. Stealing from God. In Leviticus chapter 25 and in verse 23, I want you to hear what God says there. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. God gives Israel this land. And in the law of Moses, he says, I'm giving you this land. But then here he says, now, while you're there, it's still my land. You're just, please understand, you're still passing through my land in that sense. And another passage that's similar to this, not quite, but similar and one that we know better, Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 10. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give you with great and good cities you did not build, and houses full of all good things you did not fill, and cisterns you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees you did not plant, and when you eat are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, in that passage, Moses is saying what? God's giving you his land that is, in our terms today, it's like moving into a fully furnished house, right? You've seen these renovation shows with homes where they, the way it looks to us, now these people have to pay money and penalties and taxes and all that you don't hear about. But they move into this renovated house full of all brand new furniture, and there's even food sitting around, right? I mean, the refrigerator's even stocked, and everything's just perfect when they move in on that. And that's, we look at that, but that's legitimately, that's what happens with Israel. They walk into Israel, to the land of Canaan, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do, and the picture's painted as if there's still warm meals on the table they could eat. That's how furnished the land is for them. And God warns, he says, when you go in and I give you my land, you're going to forget me. Remember that proverb, don't let me be too rich, lest I forget the Lord. And that's the idea here. Well, so the law of Moses had several commands that were tied to the idea that God gave the people the land. And those commands and things that were established in the law of Moses were designed to remind them on a regular basis that they were there because God had blessed them by giving them all of this. For instance, the festivals were tied to that, and especially the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Booths, right? The Feast of Weeks. Those festivals were tied directly to this idea God's blessed you with this land flowing with milk and honey, And then you go and you celebrate these feasts to remember God and what he's done for you. The Sabbath was an observation of rest, but part of that was also a rest from your work that to remember what God's blessed you with in that day. The Sabbath year was a year dedicated to that. And the Jubilee year was even more dedicated to that, where slaves were released and land was restored, and all of these things in this law all goes back as a reminder, God gave us this land. Your sacrifices. Part of the reason that Jesus calls it a den of robbers is because they're not sacrificing really anything. The law of Moses was set up for you to give back from the flock God had given you, to give back to him. And tithes were also directly related. You gave up a tenth as a reminder. Now, I understand that the tithing was set there and established to provide for the Levites. But for the other tribes, the purpose of the tithing was this: to remember you've been blessed and return that back to God. And in that sense, that's where the idea of Jeremiah 7 and what Jesus says and tithing is all connected together, is this idea of what really we read in the Proverbs. You are either going to become so rich you forget God and steal from God that way, or poor and steal and profane God that way. And both extremes are violations of this command in that sense. Does it make sense to everybody how that all fits together? And how those things connect? And it's really important for us to kind of grasp that and see that. Any thoughts or comments to follow up with any of that? Okay, got about 13 minutes. Let's turn to page 29 and talk about a few things over there. What does Matthew 6:33 say? Surely y'all don't have to look that up. What does Matthew 6:33 say? Yeah. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, all these things will be added to you. What things? The things in the preceding context that Jesus talks about your anxiety about. How that you're worried about what you're going to wear, and the grass of the field is clothed by God. And the birds, they never worry about what they're going to eat, but you worry about what you're going to eat. And if you would just seek the rule of God in your life as the priority that tops all priorities, God's going to provide those things for you. Matthew 7 and verses 7 through 11 is where it talks about ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open. If you ask, you'll receive. Now, verse 9 starting in that, which one of you asks for a son for a bread, we'll give him a stone, or if he asks for fish, we'll give him a serpent. If you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who's in heaven give good things to those who ask him? James 1, he's the giver of all good gifts. Philippians 4, don't worry about anything, but through prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. All of these passages mean what? They all together, what do they represent? What? Trust in God to provide for you. Trust in God to provide for you. Well, what is stealing when you think about those passages? You're not trusting in God at all. Who are you? You're trusting in yourself then. And when self doesn't have the ability or opportunity for whatever reason that may be, you keep putting trust in yourself, which means you got to beg, borrow, or steal to take care of yourself rather than trust in God. And as the Proverbs said, as we've already pointed out, to some degree, God understands that's what man will do. And so do we. I mean, truthfully, if your kids weren't going to eat, and the only way to feed them was to steal, chances are you would steal to feed your kids. I think we can acknowledge that's what we would do. And we may do that with the intent of paying back later or whatever it may be, but we're going to try to take care of our family. I think it's really important to point something out, though, and that's Ephesians 4 and verse 28. To me, this is a powerful text that Paul says to the Ephesian brethren that we need to make sure we connect here. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. What does Paul say about stealing here? What does he say about stealing? Stop it. But he goes on. Not just stop stealing, but what else?
There's an alternative.
Okay? What's the alternative?
That is honest work.
Honest
So
work.
turn away from dishonesty to honesty.
Okay? By the way, does he say that the honest work is going to be easy? No. The words labor here and working with your own hands, they should call you back a little bit to Genesis 3 and the punishment that Adam receives, that he will now work with his hands and by the sweat of his brow. There is part of this passage that does say, by the way, connect that back for just a moment. The attempts to get off easy and not do honest labor by man are an attempt to circumvent the punishment of Genesis chapter 3. The end of the day. All goes back to the garden, Joe. But then there's this last thing he says here in Ephesians 4:28 is don't steal anymore. You go to work and you work hard so you can buy yourself a bigger house, right? No, so you can help other people. Get Charlie and Mike. Sometimes we want to read the Old Testament and we want to go, well, you know, back then, they had to leave the corners of their field. And we don't have any of those commands today. Really? Because Ephesians 4:28 sure feels that way. Go work, help others. Sure feels a lot like what they were told back then. Charlie?
The notion of stealing has gotten muddled in our evolution as we've grown older. And it seems to me that there are so many ways that you can slip into stealing and not know that you're actually stealing. Or that there are people out there that, let's say you've got X product and you know that in 10 months that X product's going to be worth 5 times more. And you have an opportunity to sell that to somebody, but you won't because you know it's going to be way more. The ideas that we have about commerce and all of the things that go along with that, the stealing has gotten blurred. At least that's my opinion. It's you know, you think about you think about soldiers in war, or think about the Civil War, and they took all the best when they came through Georgia. Well, was that stealing? Or, you know, they're feeding their troops the best of the enemy that they defeated. But those sorts of decisions we make in our minds are so important about that. I refuse to take something from somebody that's trying to sells me something at half price. I mean, I just don't feel right doing that. You know, if you, I go back and I say, do you not realize this is worth X dollars? And, you know, a lot of times they'll say, well, don't worry about it, and go ahead. Anyway, I guess that's,
Yeah, I'll just say that it's hard to, somebody willfully offers you something half price, it's their property, just like in Acts 5, they can do what they want. You can go back and make sure. I think that the issue here is when we're deceptive and we're trying to take advantage of people is the greater issue in all of that. The principle here is, that I want to see from Ephesians 4:28, is that we have a responsibility to provide for those who are in need. And by the way, under the law of Moses, it was the individual's responsibility within Israel to provide for the needy in that way. I'm not saying there weren't other ways from a more collective level, but there was an individual responsibility when it came to the strangers and sojourners, the non-Jew. That was the responsibility of the individual Jew to take care of those things. And you see the most notable circumstance of that is Boaz, right? You see Boaz goes beyond what is required of him in order to provide for Ruth and Naomi. That responsibility under this new covenant still applies here in Ephesians 4:28, that as individuals, it's our responsibility to help other people. And I'm just going to be blunt and tell you, I think sometimes we wait for the government to do it or some other agency to do it or maybe the church to do it. But it should begin with us. That's who should be the ones. 1 John 3 talks about this idea of between brethren. If your brother's in need and you have what he needs, you should give him what he needs. You shouldn't just pray for him and then here you have what he needs. I'll tell this story. June and Victoria are sick, but Caleb texted me the other day and he's like, do you have a folding chair you'd be willing to get rid of? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. He's like, I'll pay you for it. I just need a folding chair from the closet when he's getting ready. And I said, you can have it. He's like, well, no, I'll pay it for it. It's like, no. I said, it's biblical. 1 John 3 says I have to give it to you, like, because I have extra ones. I can't take your money for that, And that was half joking, but there is a portion of that, hey, that's true. Absolutely true. Here's the catch for us. We're trained from an early age not to be generous. We're trained from an early age of what's mine, right? We don't share. We don't give. And we hoard up for ourselves. And that's just not what God's people are supposed to be like. We're supposed to help out other people. That's, I think here, one of the things that's interesting is it's not just enough to stop stealing and work, but it's work to provide for other people. Do you look for opportunities to help others? That's the spirit of Ephesians 4:28. So look for ways to help other people. That's what's being taught there. And I think when we understand that, that helps us to see kind of this last question about, well, how does that help me love my neighbor as myself? I just want you to tie back to the Samaritan for a minute. Well, I think a lot of us, when it comes to loving our neighbor as ourselves, our first question is kind of like the lawyer. Okay, but who really is my neighbor? Who really is my neighbor? And the point of Jesus' story is everyone's your neighbor. Everyone. is your neighbor. So we're out of time, and I just encourage you to not steal and go be neighborly. Love your neighbor. We'll see you Sunday. Yes.